Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 12 on biodiversity, which relates to your short paper that you're doing this week. So I'll go through these slides fairly quickly because they're fairly straightforward and there's not that many of them, but it's obviously a very important topic. So let's define, let me put the slides up here. Let's define the meaning of biological diversity, okay? It can be defined as the variety of different species, the genetic variability of each species, and the variety of different ecosystems that they form. All right, so that's the way in Canada we typically define biodiversity. Biodiversity conservation, protecting flora, fauna, and vital resources, can be thought of as minimizing the loss of genetic diversity, minimizing the loss of species diversity, minimizing stresses on ecosystems, which is the major levers that we want to influence when we're dealing with biodiversity, right? Genetic and species diversity is the number of elements, genes and species, and their distinctiveness. And that's how we rate the biodiversity of various different ecosystems, right? By their genetic diversity, right? By their species diversity, and by their ecosystem characteristic diversity as well, okay? The concepts of biodiversity and ecosystems are strongly related. An integrated and stable association of living and non-living resources functioning within a defined physical location is an ecosystem, right? The ecosystem term can be applied broadly, ecosphere, or narrowly, a particular watershed, depending upon how you're scoping the different biodiversity or ecosystem subcultures that live out there, right? Or subsystems, right? And ecosystems will vary a great deal, but depending upon where they are. For example, the Mackenzie River Delta in Canada, up in the north, will have much less biodiversity than the Amazon River Basin because of climate, because of any number of other factors that come into play, right? The survivability of the climate up in the Mackenzie Delta is a lot less than you would get in the Amazon Basin. So obviously, biological diversity is much higher in the Amazon than it is in the Northern Basin, okay? Three categories are often used to conceptualize values of biodiversity to ecosystems and humans: ecosystem function benefits, species or genetic use benefits, and existence benefits, all right? Ecosystem function benefits are a very broad category, including pollutant filtration, nutrient cycling, and climate control, right? Ecosystem functions to clean the environment, to maintain climate, to maintain the overall features of our natural environment. So ecosystems have certain characteristics, right? Quite a bit different between the ecosystem survivability of a diverse boreal forest over the region right next to a trending desertification or a desert, right? So it depends on what the ecosystem function benefits that exist there will depend on the nature of the ecosystem itself. Species or genetic use benefits, right? Biodiversity use benefits are derived from exploiting species or the genetic properties of species. For example, in pharmaceutical production, for recreational activities like fishing, bird watching, sport hunting, etc. All right? These use benefits are a very significant issue because so many different types of natural remedies and pharmaceuticals can be derived from the genetic diversity within an ecosystem, right? And they are, right? Existence benefits are derived from the aesthetic enjoyment of species, the moral satisfaction felt by people in knowing that they have preserved wildlife, and people's spiritual relationship to nature. It's a critically important issue. Many studies have demonstrated the psychological impacts of living on moonscapes as opposed to the more rich ecosystem, right? For humans. Not to mention the wildlife that live in these ecosystems. People do get a lot of aesthetic enjoyments, a lot of psychological and moral satisfaction from having wildlife and knowing that wildlife's out there. Even if they don't go and see it all the time, knowing it's there, being able to go for a walk in a forested area where there's trails and you can see wildlife, and that is a humongous issue for mental health, okay, for many, many people. And obviously culturally for indigenous peoples and so on is that much more important because of the nature of the culture. Okay. Stresses on biodiversity can be grouped as well. Negative effects on biodiversity arise from conditions created by industrialization, right? We never exploited resources like we learned early in the course to anywhere near the extent we do now because of industrialized operations, right? Industrial scale operations, right? Human population growth and trade liberalization, all leading to an intensification of economic activities that depletes biodiversity values to ecosystems and humans. All right. I think we can all understand the massive increase of exploitation of natural resources in the environment that came with industrialization. We talked about that earlier in the term. Human population growth is an obvious one, right? We can't continue to have rapidly growing global population and expect that biodiversity will survive. It's impossible. Okay, it can't be done. So no matter how sophisticated your technology becomes, people have to live. They have to live in places. They have to eat. They have to use fuel for heating, and sometimes that's wood, and so on. Right? I mean, we can't be so naive as to assume that we can continue to grow our population at the rate we have since the turn of the last century and expect that. Really since industrialization, and expect that we're going to be able to maintain biodiversity. It's just not a realistic outcome. Okay, resources have to come from somewhere. Technology can make exploitation of resources, more efficient. We can do more with fewer amounts of resources, but technology is very unlikely to ever overcome the need to maximize exploitations of biodiversity in the natural environment due to having more people to feed, more people to provide medicine to, more people to house, more people to et cetera, right? Overpopulation of a geographical area often leads to unsustainable exploitation of forests for wood burning, cooking and heating, urban sprawl and associated transportation infrastructure, overtaking productive agricultural land, and the draining of wetlands for farming or housing, right? Even though we've done a much better job in the last 20 years of regulating the treatment of wetlands, the fact is that we still have lots of people building houses and building buildings in floodplains or wetlands in this country. Okay, it's going on constantly. All right. An economic expansion of an area accelerates these trends, combined with industrial pollution stresses on flora and fauna. When we're dealing with biodiversity, we can't forget the pollution effects of industrialization, which weakens biodiversity as well, right? It makes areas uninhabitable for certain species, or weakens. It combines to weaken a species survivability when you combine climate change with chemical contamination and with urban noise and so on. Puts a lot of pressure on that species and begins killing off the species, right? And these are just realities. And trade liberalization, along with the economic growth, has magnified threats to biodiversity. First, there's been intensification of natural resource extraction for export in many countries. Many countries like Canada, for example, we exploit way more of our natural resources than we can use in our own country. We export vast amounts of natural resources, right, to other countries. And the impacts of this on pollution and waste generation, resource depletion and habitat destruction and transformation in the absence of public policies is great. And we've seen this. I mean, all you have to do is see the aerial photographs of the Alberta oil sands to see what's going on. Back in the day, before we brought in stronger forestry policies, you could drive over large swaths of British Columbia and see basically clear-cutted areas, miles and miles of clear-cutted areas, right? Which then became uninhabitable for the species that used to habit it, right? And these are all the kinds of things that can happen when you're into trade-related exploitation. Not only that, but trade brought in a trend for a lot of developing countries. In addition to the first trend, where developing countries are also heavily impacted, exploiting their natural environment for exploitation of natural resources to get, currency, right? To get international currency, income. There's been an intensification of monoculture in food production for export. If you want to be successful in food export markets, you got to specialize. What that means is that areas that used to be biologically diverse become agricultural monoculture production, right? So they're just growing sugar cane, or they're just growing something else, and they're exporting that en masse. So what used to be highly diverse areas, and this is what we're seeing in the Amazon, what used to be highly diverse areas for biodiversity end up becoming monoculture environments. Okay. And monoculture increases trade dependence, so it also tends to magnify the problem, because imports are required to satisfy domestic needs, and while domestic production capacity service the export market. So there's this exchange that goes on, and in order to get more and more money that you need, because sugar cane sells for less than computers, and your country doesn't produce computers, it produces sugar cane, you have to exploit larger and larger amounts of land, you have to intensify your sugar cane production, and I'm just using sugar cane as one example, and then so therefore more and more and more of the land becomes monoculture instead of being biologically diverse. And research points to the complete transformation of ecosystems when a large variety of indigenous crops are displaced by single crop, bringing about the homogenization of the natural systems, right? Third, increased economic activity associated with the export markets led to development of land use pressures linked to servicing trade, right? If you go along the border, for example, between the Mexico and the United States in the south, you'll see what I'm talking about. The infrastructure that's built up along borders for trade ends up basically becoming moonscaped, right? Because of truck activity, infrastructure activities, industrial warehousing, all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of the infrastructure of trade also puts a lot of pressure, and transportation and trade puts a lot of pressure on biodiversity throughout many countries in the world, right? Local ecosystems can be completely transformed. Like on the Mexico-American border, trade patterns that inadequately account for regional biodiversity conservation happens all the time, right? So you go into some regions, you go between countries, say in Latin America, and you see that a lot too. Along the border regions, 100 to 200 miles on each side, all sort of transportation infrastructure, warehousing, plants being set up to produce goods for trade, everything in large swaths of ecosystems get basically moonscaped, okay? So there's also that whole issue. And fourth, trade liberalization agreements establish a framework of rules and encourage trade patterns that affect public policies, and in turn biodiversity conservation. There are, trade rules. I don't have a lecture in this term, but in the second, in Environmental Policy 2, you get one looking at the impact of trade liberalization rules on environmental policy. And there are a lot of restrictions as to how you can regulate the environmental protection under trade rules. Won't get into that too much this time, but just flag it now, and next term you get into a bit more, okay? All right? So, and of course, trade liberalization, when you open up to a global competitive market, it means that you're into competitiveness, right? You're competing with other countries, which leads to greater and greater intensification. We can produce more for cheaper. We can, our volumes, we can increase our volumes so that we get more of the market than our competitor. All these pressures to continue to grow, very much like the GDP argument we had early in the term. All these pressures to grow will affect biodiversity. There's no question about that, right? All right, so finally, trade liberalization agreements establish certain obligations not to develop public policies that are inconsistent with trade rules. And as I said, you'll pick up that issue in the second term, right? Environmental Policy 2. Okay? And I'm not going to get into these slides in a great deal, but you can see the scope of international agreements that impact on biodiversity issues, right? Yet we still have constant pressure on biodiversity and endangered species around the world, right? We have you see all the international ones here, right? There's shipping protocols, there are regional instruments that have been developed, and in Canada we have a number of pieces of legislation that impact on biodiversity, okay? So what I want you to do is is realize that these biodiversity pressures exist, and most of them are commonsensical pressures. It's not like trying to study chemicals and understand the complexity of the chemicals' impact on the environment. Most of the biodiversity impacts on the environment, we know what they are, right? We can see them. The problem is that biodiversity is so tied up with the dominant economic paradigm of growth. Population growth, economic growth, industrial intensification, trade growth, everything, biodiversity tends to be caught right at the nexus of all of these issues, which makes it a very, very complex issue to move forward with, okay? On that score, I'm going to let you go. Good luck with your short papers for this week, and talk to you again later. Bye-bye now.